All right, guys. It looks like there was a little mishap with the time in terms of when it was advertised versus when we have it scheduled. So we're gonna get going, but this is recorded, so we'll be able to put it out and send it out to everybody. So we're gonna talk a little bit today about high temperature fermentations. I'm Kara Taylor. I'm our head of laboratory operations. And if you haven't met me before, I've been at White Labs for almost 11 years now. And so high temperature fermentations are something that I have a lot of experience in terms of dealing with. And in terms of, I'm a little too fast there, in terms of dealing with, in terms of troubleshooting. And so today we're going to discuss about how fermentation temperatures can influence the beer style, the strain selection, and also how it will look at for yeast-derived metabolites, flavor and aroma compounds. We're going to discuss when and why a brewer or home brewer would perform a high temperature fermentation, and then, kind of what is too hot and what are those issues and how do we, really resolve them. So really if you look at, strain temperature, recipes, I really think that fermentation temperature is one of the biggest controls of fermentation that makes a beer what we would say good or taste better. You can have all of the best ingredients, you can have a great recipe, but fermentation temperature control is really one of the parameters that's going to make that beer taste a lot better. And so there's tons of different options, to do that, and we'll look at that today. But one of those options is just sort of like, one of these large jackets that you can get to put around, a carboy if you don't have a glycol control. So it's a little confusing sometimes because we're always talking about yeast and what the optimal temperature is for a strain. But in terms of yeast in general, yeast love warm temperatures, even lager strains. So when we're growing yeast, when we're propagating it, we're doing it, close to 30 Celsius. We're not keeping it in that, classic ale range temperature. And the reason that we're doing that is because that is where those strains ultimately thrive in terms of activity, right? But that doesn't always mean that they're going to be making good flavor and aroma compounds at that temperature. So, if they love warm temperatures, why are we fermenting them so cold? When we think about lagers, those are strains that can ferment at colder temperatures and make really good flavors and aroma compounds, or I should say make lack thereof at those temperatures. But in reality, they don't want to be at that lower temperature, right? They don't thrive there. They just have the ability to withstand that stressor as being much colder, right? And so really the reason that we have these dialed in temperatures is so that we can make the flavor and aroma compounds that we prefer in that style. So why do we get weird flavors at high temperatures? So ultimately, you're going to have all these flavor and aroma compounds being made the entire time. Why do we get more of them at higher temperatures? And really the answer to that is enzymes within the yeast, right? So we've got all these enzymes that at each step of glycolysis and at each step is making different compounds, right? So if you think about acetaldehyde to ethanol, right? You need an enzyme in order to convert acetaldehyde to alcohol. And the reason that this is happening more at higher temperatures is because those enzymes at those higher temperatures are activated more. So we have more enzyme activity, and therefore, increases fusels, increases esters in that beer compared to if we had it at lower temperatures. They're activated there. So here's a quick graph to kind of show you at two different fermentation temperatures at 75 degrees Fahrenheit and 66 degrees Fahrenheit. We have some GC analysis, some gas chromatography analysis here showing different fusules, like the propanol, isoamyl alcohol, and then we also have diacetyl esters, ethyl acetate, and you can see at that higher temperature, almost all of those are at a higher parts per million than the lower fermented beer at 66 degrees Fahrenheit, or sorry, yeah, 66 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, that's going to be because of that increase in enzyme activity, right? But what is, some of these might not look very different in terms of 108 parts per million to 115 parts per million for isoamyl alcohol. That might not be that big a deal. But if we look at what those flavor thresholds are, the lower the flavor threshold is, the bigger the difference in terms of perceived aroma and flavor is going to be when we look at the differences between 66 and 75. So the one I wanted to highlight here is acetaldehyde. And you can tell at 66 degrees Fahrenheit, we have about 8 parts per million of acetaldehyde under the threshold that's around 10 parts per million. But at 75 degrees Fahrenheit, we have acetaldehyde level of 152, which, as you can imagine, must smell pretty bad, right? And so I would say acetaldehyde is the #1 off flavor that I will get in a beer that is fermented too warm. I would say that although, our California ale yeast is one of the most foolproof yeasts that we have, it is a big offender at higher temperatures for acetaldehyde from what I've seen. And so, really trying to keep that beer under 70 degrees Fahrenheit is really going to be helpful in controlling that level. So if you've dealt with any acetaldehyde issues, whether you're home brewing or in your own brewery, work on bringing that temperature down, and I could almost guarantee that it's going to help reduce some of the acetaldehyde issues that you're seeing there. Sometimes when we talk about acetaldehyde, we think about it as something, green apple, that should be a pleasant smell, that should be yummy, right? But really, I kind of, I sometimes think about it as like pumpkin or squash, but it's usually more offensive. It's usually your nose is burning a little bit when we have high acetaldehyde levels. So, so typically it's not a pleasant aroma. So, just in general, in terms of typical ranges for fermentation temperature for different beverages, what we're looking at here is what I would say temperature ranges that have been dictated by tradition, right? So these are the ranges that this industry has used over time. And it doesn't mean that those are the only things, but they've usually dictated from tradition, right? So wine would be sometimes in caves, and they're a little bit cooler underground. But sometimes wine can be fermented really, really warm. There's these large ranges, right? Beer is a little all over the place, but again, dictated a lot by tradition, by season. And I would say the biggest difference is spirits, right? And spirits are traditionally fermented at much higher temperatures. You can really get over 100 degrees Fahrenheit fermentation from a whiskey. And really why that is tradition, and there's not a lot of temperature control for those fermentations. But in something like spirits, that fermentation, some of those off flavors aren't going to transfer over to the distillate. And so therefore you can ferment it higher. And also you have this, really, really fast ferment. So it really depends on how much of that original flavor is seen in the end product. In wine, it's really common to ferment a little bit cooler because there's this idea that if you ferment slower, less of those aromatics, especially from the grapes, is being exhausted, through CO2 or into the air, right? So if we have the slower fermentation, we get to keep more of the flavor. And so that's, very traditional that we see in wine. So if we think about something in terms of ranges for different yeast strains for beer styles, again, we're sort of all over the board, right? But I would say that the American versions of these styles have really ramped up the temperatures. And I think this is primarily due to a lot of home brewing that, was happening in the States. And basically it was like, we don't have temperature control. Let's see what happens when we do things at these temperatures. And have really increased the range in terms of when of how some of those styles are being done. So I think if you went to Belgium and if you go to Belgium or you go to France and you look at these Belgian saison characters, I don't think you see a lot of 90 or these really really high fermentation temperatures for some of those styles. That's been more of a little bit of American style, but nevertheless, I think also can produce, really nice beers. So some of that has just been dictated based on the equipment that we've had over the last couple of years. So, really this fermentation in terms of flavor and aroma is a balancing act. And so there's a little bit of a balancing act between temperature and pitching rate. So I'm going to go through this and then, just try to stick with me for a second, but I'll try to touch on these points continuously throughout the rest of the, the PowerPoint. But basically, if we increase the pitching rate and add more yeast to that beer, we're going to have less growth happening because we've got more cells that have to share all the sugar source, right? And so if we have less growth, we have less new cells being made, we're going to have less flavor being made. And so this is really common of why if we want to increase, some of the aromas in terms of maybe something like a Hefeweizen or saison, we want more esters. We tend to underpitch so we can get some more flavor there. If we reduce that pitching rate, we can get more flavor, more aroma compounds happening. But the other way that we can do this is by increasing the temperature. But it is a little bit of a balancing act. So it's not a 1-for-1. So if we increase that temperature, we have a faster fermentation. But if we reduce it, those cells are acting a little bit slower. Again, it really has to do with enzymes, right? In terms of how much enzymes are activated at those certain temperatures and how fast that fermentation is going to happen, how fast they're going to grow. And so that temperature is going to dictate really the speed of that growth and some of those metabolites that are happening there. So let's say you don't have any temperature control, and this is, primarily looking at either nano breweries or home brewing, right? But finding a temporary solution, something like an ice bath or a water bath to help keep that beer as cool as possible is one of the better solutions. And why I call this a temporary solution is because the majority of metabolites, all of that flavor and aroma, is primarily done within the first 72 hours, because that's when the primary or the majority, or even more than the majority of those carbohydrates, those sugars, are fermented, right? And that's how that flavor is going to be derived, is during that time. That's when with the yeast metabolism, right? So if you can keep it cold for at least the first 3 to 4 days, you're going to be okay. And if for some reason that, that ice, you can't keep up with it after the 4th or 5th day, it's probably going to be okay, because you have the majority of those carbohydrates fermented out. The other option is to be able to use a more forgiving strain. And we'll talk about some of those strains that are available, but there's a reason that we have a top 10 we're constantly selling, and mainly because those are more forgiving, they're more robust, they're not as delicate in terms of the fermentation profiles you need. So I think that's something to think about is should you change the strain that you're using. So another thing that happens a lot is, what will happen if my glycol turned off early? This is a call I've gotten often. It's like, we knocked out, the yeast was added, and someone forgot to set the glycol, or it malfunctioned, there could be a huge range of results, really. But really, it's about how much was fermented during that time period. And the amount of growth that happened during that time period is really going to dictate how much off flavor, how different it's going to be from a batch that was fermented at the correct temperature. So it could be really difficult to blend out flavors, especially if you've got something like acetaldehyde or a lot of higher fusels, those compounds that make something feel hot, like really hot. But you could also try to blend it out with another batch. So that could be an option. But unfortunately, when you have glycol issues early in that fermentation, it can be difficult to troubleshoot that. Glycol issues later, not as big of a deal, based on what I was talking about before, in terms of if you don't have that much carbohydrate left, you're not going to have that much additional flavor added. Okay, so what strains are most forgiving? I think some of these are more obvious in terms of the Belgian yeast, right? High ester profile, phenols. And so when we have some of those higher alcohols, they get sort of muddied with the esters and the phenols, and we don't perceive them nearly as much. But I would say that if you like your Belgian beers with less ester profile, that high fermentation temperature isn't going to help, right? So if you want something that's a little bit more muted, I think, the high esters or the higher fermentation temperature is going to inhibit that. Saison yeast are also really great at those temperatures. Hefeweizen yeast, for obvious reasons. And then I would say the most popular right now are these kveik yeast, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. But these are strains that have been derived out of farms in Norway and have proven to produce really clean and nice beers with no phenols at these higher temperatures. I think some other things that people haven't quite are kind of different is looking at the Sac Brux Trois strain, our WLP 644. Again, another fruitier strain, doesn't make a lot of high alcohol. So, just something to think about, I think, for something that's higher fermentation temperature. And then also Brett or other wild yeast strains could be beneficial. With Brett, we've got at that higher temperature, you can get some of those esters. You might get an increase in acids too, so something to think about. But, I think you can also make some really nice beers, in the 70-degree Fahrenheit, mid 70s, maybe low 80s with Brett or some other wild yeast strains to make some interesting flavors. So, why kveik? And again, I'm probably pronouncing this incorrectly. I know that, but we've talked about a lot, and I think some of these beers have been really, really interesting, right? So these strains, they have been found just by some genetic sequencing that they're sort of their own subset of strains. And they are what we call POF negative. So there's no phenolics found in them typically, and which is really cool because most Belgian saison strains, they all are phenolic positive, which really limits you in the type of styles that you can make. And, with this type of strain, the amount of styles that you can make is much larger when you have less phenolics. They are considered to be STA1 negative, which is the gene that is detected for a strain to be Saccharomyces cerevisiae diastaticus. And so that means that they won't over attenuate. And again, this is a list that is I can't say this is for every single strain, but this is, I would say, almost all of them that are commercially found right now. So the really interesting part of these, right, is that they're neutral, clean flavors at these high fermentation temperatures. And when I say high fermentation, I'm talking 90 degrees, 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And then also, they have low acetaldehyde and fusel production. So that is really, really unusual. And the other really unusual characteristic of these is that some of the strains are very flocculent. And if you've used a Belgian Hefeweizen saison strain before, while they work really great at high fermentation temperatures, they're usually not very flocculent whatsoever. And so that is a real big positive on some of these strains that are flocculent. It's sort of the best of all of these worlds. So some of these strains I would say are so here's 6 different kveik strains that we have here at White Labs. Originally when we did this, we just kind of started with one, which was the 518, this Abschlag kveik yeast. And we thought, that was a great place to start. But as we started playing around with these a little bit more, we definitely saw there was a large difference in the strains once we started playing around with temperatures, when we started playing around with pitching rates. You could see how different some of these strains were. And so I would say that of this list, we have, strains like Abschlag, which I think is a great strain for something that's actually very clean, to something like Hornindal, which I would say is much on the fruitier end. Same thing with similar to the Sigmund. And so you do have some of that increase in esters. So maybe not appropriate for every beer style, but have been really interesting to see how they've worked well with a lot of IPAs or hazy beers, anything that's dry hopped. Those esters are really complementing those hops. Whereas in if you remember 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, white IPAs and these Belgian IPAs were becoming really popular because those esters were also playing really well with those hops, but maybe the phenols weren't as complementary and just not for everyone and not as easy drinking. And so I think some of these strains have been really, really awesome for that. And so, these are really strains that I'm telling people use this summer when you don't have a lot of temperature control, or if you live in an area or somewhere in the world that just doesn't have access to refrigeration very easily. I think these are the perfect strains to be making a well-rounded portfolio of beers with less off flavors. So just some of the fermentations we've done here at White Labs, we've done 2 different beers. One, we did a hazy IPA, and we did, if you know anything about our brewery, we can divert the wort into different fermenters. And so we made one fermenter we added our London Fog, which is one of our hazy strains. And then the other one, we used the kveik, the Abschlag strain. And both of these were pitched at 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato. And the Abschlag was set at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and the London Fog was set at 66. And you can see that in this beer, they basically attenuated very similarly, and also they got to terminal a very similar rate. And this is likely due to the high cell count that was added to this. But also the fact that for our wort supply, we have an issue where we can't start the beer because we're diverting wort, right? We have to start it closer to 66. And so we had basically free rise to 90 in that fermenter. So we have a little bit of constraints there in terms of that beer, but it doesn't always mean that it's going to be, that much faster. So we tried it again on another IPA, a collaboration we did with Hopsteiner, very similar profile, but that Abschlag got down to terminal within 4 days, and that was about what I think people are seeing is about 4 to 5 days, and so it is definitely faster. But the reason it's faster is because that temperature increase, right? So if we set all of these strains to 90 degrees, we would likely see very, very similar results for that. One of the things that we didn't do was, reduce the pitching rate on here. And we have done a couple of beers where we've done that now. And you can really see a big difference in terms of those strains. So if you are looking to get more out of those, is in terms of different characters, I would encourage you to try messing around with a lower pitch rate and a higher temperature, and see what kind of flavors you can get out of there. So, really, I think that controlling temperature is ultimately the best way to make good beer flavors. But if you don't have that, there's a lot of options for you in terms of, summer brewing, or depending on where you live, that you can make something that's clean and, and pleasant. And so just kind of understanding how some of those strains, perform at those temperatures will allow you to make, the best decision in terms of what you're brewing in that flavor profile. So with that, I will thank you, and I will also take any questions that anyone wants to put on there. I know I saw in the middle, I think someone raised their hand. So if anyone has any questions on there. Cool. Well, I will wait a second for people to add them on there. I think people are raising their hands, but because you can't talk to me, you have to put it in the Q&A. But if you do have any questions, my email is Kara, K-A-R-A, @whitelabs.com. So you can always feel free to do that later. The first question that is on here is thoughts on temperature concerning distiller's yeast. So most distiller's yeast does allow you to just ferment that at a much warmer temperature in terms of, I mean, you could be almost up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Once you get past that 90 degrees, your viability is likely going to start dropping. So your ability to reuse that yeast over and over is going to drop. But if for most distilling, that's going to be really, that's just going to be, you're going to be one and done, right? You're going to boil it after that. So distiller's yeast, you can bring the temperature up. I'm sure there's probably some, classic distillers that have very specific fermentation profiles, and they probably do that so they can have consistency with that flavor profile. But I would say at home, or just one-offs, you can jack that temperature up. And that's why there's also sort of a misconception with distiller's yeast in that, they make more alcohol, which is not always true for some distiller's yeast. Really, it's that fast fermentation because of that higher temperature that's happening. All right, cool. Well, thank you guys for joining, and any questions, again, you feel free to send me an email, Kara @whitelabs.com, and thanks for joining.